We have a couple special guests who I'm going to introduce. One of them is going to introduce our terrific speaker. The first special guest is my wife, Donna Lucas. And so Harry Truman used to introduce his wife as the boss. And then their daughter, we have a daughter, Katie, his daughter was Margaret. And so Margaret was the boss's boss. So the boss is here, but the boss's boss is not here. And so it's also my pleasure to introduce our city councilman, Steve Hansen, who's here. And he was the one who suggested that we have this event. So I'm in his debt generally, but specifically for helping us put this event on.
Not at all, Greg. Thank you.
Sure.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Greg, for the nice introduction. It's wonderful to see so many people here. And this, as Greg mentioned, I met Jim, and it was an odd thing. Sometimes kindred spirits bump into each other. We were at Delancey Street in San Francisco for an event for Kamala Harris. What was that, about April, I want to say? March. And I just went because it was $250, and you know, these presidential events can be so expensive. But out of it, I met Jim, and Jim and I started talking about revitalizing public spaces. And that's when I learned about his book about the San Francisco Civic Center. And so, of course, we got contact information, but I bought it, and it took about 4 months for it to arrive from, I think it's University of Nevada, Reno Press. And the reason I bought it and the reason I was so interested in bringing this talk here, and thank you, Greg, for being willing to be part of this, was we are reinventing and trying to preserve some of our own public spaces here. And we have some of the same challenges of a city like San Francisco. In fact, the Supreme Court that was supposed to meet here in this room, they left us to go to San Francisco over 100 years ago. And so it's sort of kismet that we're bringing a little bit of it back today. But you think about spaces just adjacent to a Capitol Mall. The many different versions of Capitol Mall that have been proposed or built never lived up to the promise, right? But the original M Street of Capitol Mall, with housing and commercial jazz clubs, was a vibrant community, but that got sanitized and bulldozed for something that's akin to the little porch on a suburban tract home, where it looks nice, but you can't use it, right? Right now, we're in the midst of advancing a plan to make Capitol Mall a space for people again, to help activate it, bring more housing in, but to essentially do some of the things that Jim did in San Francisco in revitalizing and helping people understand the meaning of place for Civic Center Plaza. We're also trying to do this through a couple other means. And as you think tonight, and as you reflect on this talk, whether it's the Crocker Park project that the Crocker wants to do to create a sculpture garden there in front of the museum and enhance and connect the museum better to Capitol Mall and the Golden One Center and the Capitol itself, or it's the city's attempts to now reinvest back into the waterfront. You know, it used to be the river was a threat to us, so we turned our back on us. We put a freeway in the middle. Thankfully, John F. Kennedy stopped the freeway from going right through the heart of it, and they went around. But now we're trying to figure out how to bring that very same meaning and revitalization, not necessarily of wiping away the history, but how do we bring meaning back to a place? And what was interesting with Old Sac, we set aside $52 million of bond money generated by hotels, people who come to stay in our hotels, like Jim is tonight. Thank you, Jim. But we didn't necessarily come with ideas right away. We wanted the public, through an ideas contest, to bring us what they would like to see. And that's that kind of iteration that I think has brought some of the greatest and grandest public spaces to life, and the community that occupies them a place to be. So it's with my great pleasure to introduce James Haas and to hear a little bit about what they did with the San Francisco Civic Center.
Well, this is a great honor. I have some roots in Sacramento. My great-grandfather came here and established the Buffalo Brewery. Some of you may recall that. He came from Buffalo. That was the reason it was called the Buffalo Brewery. He got out of the business and died around the turn of the century. But, and unfortunately, none of my relatives have lived in Sacramento since, but I do have a small foot in Sacramento. I, without getting into a lot of details, have spent 35 years trying to improve our Civic Center. From the days we built, the proposal was to build a new public library, which we accomplished, and it is part of the complex. So Steve, I think, is a little fulsome with his praise because there's still a lot of work to do to get San Francisco Civic Center, particularly the public realm, to be welcoming and useful to people in today's world. There's lots of stories and lots of material in my book, and I have to struggle to always keep these talks under control. But what I'm going to do is talk about 3 themes. The first is, what is a civic center? The second one is, how did the one in San Francisco get built? And the third one is the last 50, 60, 70 years in which our civic center was, to a large degree, misunderstood and neglected. So the civic... Oh, one of these microphones I have to swallow to...
I think so. Like maybe if you could just...
Does it go up any further? Yeah. Okay. Civic center is a term which is not just descriptive, but it has a whole, if you will, ethos about it. And it came about at the beginning, or the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And the thing that sort of set it off was the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, the White City, and you may have read the novel With a Murder. And here is one picture of it. Well, the City Fathers in Chicago competed to hold a World's exhibition to commemorate Columbus discovering America. We won't get into whether that's true or not. And they succeeded, and one of the things they wanted to do was to tell the world that Chicago had recovered from their catastrophic fire of 1871. And so they engaged Frederick Olmsted, the famous landscape architect who had spent time in California and who designed the campus at Stanford University, and had worked in Chicago before to lay out a plan which they used a sort of marshland south of the downtown of Chicago. And then they recruited Daniel Burnham and his partner, the firm was Burnham and Root, to be the master architects to set up the design. And to get it together, Burnham went to New York and other places to recruit the major architects of the day, the people in New York who were designing all the great buildings and homes, firms like McKim, Mead, and White. And those architects said, well, I don't know if we want to get involved, but Burnham used his charm and also agreed that this fair would have a uniform cornice line and be built in a neoclassical style, which was somewhat of a big change from what had happened previously, because all the architecture styles, say from the end of the Civil War until then, had been this Richardson Romanesque, heavy stone and arches and things. And they also agreed that the color would be white. And it opened in February of 1893. And by the time it was over, a third of the population of the United States, it is estimated, attended. Here's another picture? Are we in business or not? Can you operate it from the laptop? I could just say, can you change the picture with the laptop? Oh, there it is. That's the second picture. You see, it had, it was built on this great pond. It had all this sculpture, but more importantly, it was well maintained, and Thomas Edison's electric company had put in lights, and people who lived in cities at that time, lived in places where things weren't exactly pristine or planned, and they came away just dumbstruck by what they saw. Now, unfortunately, in the middle of the exhibition, there was a financial panic that put the country into a severe depression for about 5 years. So all the things that people saw, they went home and they thought about it, but they couldn't do much about it because the attention of the towns they lived in and even themselves was just keeping things together. But by the 1900, things had changed. A group of people in Cleveland, who had gone to the fair, had picked up these ideas about planning and other things, and they'd come home and wanted to create what they called the group plan. Can you change the slide? There it is. They had a contract from the federal government to build a new courthouse, and they had decided to build a public library, and they had a reforming mayor, and he got very excited about this idea of building a number of public buildings around a big rectangle square. Lake Erie, I think, is on the top. Really, the total top is a train station, which never got built. But many of the buildings in that complex were built. And you notice it has a uniform cornice line, and the buildings are mostly neoclassical. They had, the mayor had gotten powers from the governor to create a commission, and who did they recruit to help design this but Daniel Burnham and two other prominent architects from the world of prominent architects. And this sort of set the stage for the notion that a city needed to have what soon became called a civic center. Can you change the slide? A lot of the promotion of the notion of civic center was done by this man, Charles Milford Robinson, who had visited the fair. He became a journalist, and he'd written articles for Harper's and Atlantic magazine. One of them had sent him to Europe to study modern municipal administration in Germany and so forth. And he then started writing books about how cities should be planned and operated. And his second book was called Modern Civic Art, or The City Made Beautiful. In it, he talks about the idea that major cities should have a civic center, a public heart of the city. And you would build grand public buildings that were for the public, open to them. They had this notion that if you built a grand city hall, that the public business would be more honest and transparent. This was the day of graft and corruption, and that there would also be in this complex of buildings museums and libraries and opera houses and other public buildings, and so that the the public would be more committed to the community. I mean, it's sort of a quaint notion, but it's sort of a top-down idea that you can build civic infrastructure by creating this complex of buildings. And he was very specific that the buildings shouldn't be on a narrow street facing each other, but they should be distanced from each other by a big public square so you can stand back and see them and see the grandeur. So let's try the next slide. Don't change the slide, but I have a little more to say before we get to him. He propagated this idea. Others got involved. He actually became a planner, and 72 cities around the country between 1905 and 1916 developed civic center plans. Robinson did some, other well-to-known, Daniel Burnham did a few, other well-known planners and architects did others. And most of them were never built because they required taking a lot of public property to create the plaza and a lot of expense to build these buildings. But I did do a tiny bit of research. I apologize for not doing more. And in Sacramento, there was one of the 70 cities include Sacramento. And the person behind it was a local architect who you may be able to tell me more about than I found, Rudolph Herold, who came up with a plan in about 1916 to have a square in front of the courthouse, in front of the city hall with other buildings around it. And perhaps you actually succeeded in creating a civic center here, but it's not one that we know about. Can you take the next slide? Here's his plan. So you know these buildings better than I, but there's the city hall, and there's the park, and it has a sort of Mozarts set of sub-parts to it. And I think your library is there, and so forth. As I said, I didn't have time to do more research, so you can tell me how far it went, but certainly Sacramento was one that gave some thought to this idea. The next slide. In San Francisco, you all know we had this earthquake. They had built this grandiose city hall that took 30 years, and it cost 4 times more than it was estimated in the beginning. And when the 1906 earthquake came, the steel infrastructure stood up, or the steel structure stood up, but they hadn't attached all the granite pillars and other parts of the facade very well to the building, so the earthquake just caused them all to fall over. And then the fire came and went through it, and the city officials did a couple of studies and found that, one, it couldn't be reused, and 2, it was too expensive, and we better to start all over again than try to rebuild it. So, but several months after the earthquake, there was the mayor, 16 of the 18 supervisors, and the police chief were indicted for graft and corruption. There had been this, there was a political boss named Abraham Roof who was selling franchises. Then, as today, local governments give permits to businesses to operate utilities and streetcar companies and so forth. I think he dabbled a bit in houses of prostitution too. But he would make these deals, and then he'd go to the mayor and supervisors who'd say, here's what you're supposed to vote for, and by the way, here's your check for $10,000. So a group of reformers put together an effort, and with a the district attorney, who was actually not under the boss's control, and they brought this graft trial, and the following year the mayor was sent to jail, so the mayor's office was open, and they appointed a very interesting man named Edward Robeson Taylor, who was, among other things, the dean of Hastings Law School and the president of the Stanford Medical School, and a poet. And he, I think I said he was 68. And so he agreed to serve, but the chaos in the city was such that although the private sector was busily rebuilding the city, the public sector was having a hard time getting itself together to rebuild everything from the streets and sewers to a new city hall. And they eventually tore the old city hall down in 1909, but they couldn't get any agreement as to what would come next. So, next slide. San Francisco, somewhat like Chicago, competed for to hold the exhibition to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal in 1915. And the business people in San Francisco made a great effort, and they actually won. And President Taft signed the legislation in February 1911, which gave the city 4 years to get itself together, not only to, by then they hadn't even figured out where the exhibition would be held, and to build it, and of course they needed to build a whole new set of public buildings because you wouldn't want to invite the world to come to San Francisco and not have a proper place to present the city and entertain guests. So they decided, the business people, that the incumbent mayor, whose name was P.H. McCarthy, known as Pinhead McCarthy, who was he was head of the Building Trades Council and had not been very proficient at delivering services, had to go, but they had to find a candidate. So they recruited a man named James Rolfe, also known as Sonny Jim, who was a prominent businessman. He'd made money as a ship owner and a banker. He'd supervised the relief efforts in the mission after the 1906 earthquake. He actually had really good relations with the maritime unions, were very important in that time. And he agreed to run for mayor. He turned out to be an absolutely terrific fellow with all the characteristics that you would want of a good candidate, very outgoing and warm, and was able to say the right things at the right time. And he won. There was a primary in September, and he won that primary heads on. He didn't have to run in the general election. So here he is being inaugurated. He's the tall guy. The short guy is Mr. McCarthy. But during the months before he was, the months that he was mayor-elect, he decided he would get into the question of how to build a city hall and a civic center and try to solve all of the difficulties. And he rapidly went through a lot of the problems, and including where the city hall should be, how much space you needed for a civic center, what it looked like and what kind of buildings would be there. So at his inaugural, he sort of announced that this is what I think should be done, although the proper procedures had not yet been put in place. But the interesting thing was, here in 1912, it was clear in his mind that there should be a civic center in San Francisco. It should be full of very grand public buildings. They should be available to the public, and they should be on a grand plaza. So that notion, which in some circles by 1910 had become kind of passé, and people were talking about the city practical, about building, tearing down tenement houses and that sort of thing. He pushed for this. And within a few weeks, the next slide, please. His advisor was a man named John Galen Howard, who was professor of architecture at UC Berkeley, had come to Berkeley through the auspices of Mrs. George Hurst, Phoebe Epperson Hurst, who had become a great patron of the university and had at a point decided that it needed to have a master plan, and she put up the money for it, and Bernard Maybeck put the plan together. And the person they chose for the plan was a Frenchman named Émile Bernard, who was kind of cranky and didn't want to come live in Berkeley and prepare the plan. And so Mrs. Hurst decided that he had to go, and she was paying the bill, so why not? And although Howard was not the second in the list of winners of the competition, she liked him, and so she hired him. So he was in the Bay Area, and as I said, he was probably the most prominent architect on the West Coast. He had gone to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where prominent architects were trained. He had worked at McCain, White, and Mead in New York. He'd gone to MIT. He had his own practice where he'd planned a World's exhibition in Buffalo. And so Mayor Rolfe recruited him to be the master planner of its Civic Center. And the Board of Supervisors created a committee of consulting architects that is chaired by Rolfe, including a younger architect named John Reed Jr., who happened to be Mayor Rolfe's son-in-law. Mayor Rolfe said to the public, "I'm appointing my son-in-law. He's well qualified. Does anyone have a problem?" Nobody said anything, and then the third architect was a well-regarded local architect named Frederick Meyer. The three of them oversaw all the things at Civic Center, and in fact, they took over the city architect's office and to some degree looked after all the public buildings for the next 3 years that went on in San Francisco. So what Howard had to do was to, can you show the next slide? Put down a real plan. And if you look at the bottom part of this plan, it's sort of like a triangle. If you go across Larkin Street, a triangle, and that's where the old City Hall was. And the question had been whether the City Hall should be located where the new City Hall should be the old City Hall, or it should be on Van Ness. And as you can see, there's the public plaza in the middle, and lots of space for grand public buildings. In the end, this is like weeks, Howard presented to the city officials and the Board of Supervisors this plan with the City Hall at the top, at Van Ness, and buildings below. They needed $8.5 million to build the City Hall and to buy the property for the other buildings. And Mayor Rolfe had got the Board of Supervisors to authorize a bond issue and a bond election in March. And he had his campaign apparatus still in business, so they went out and campaigned hard for the bond issue. It was rather interesting. This was the first time that women could vote in San Francisco. In 1911, the state passed suffrage for women in California. Sort of as a subnote, the male voters of San Francisco voted against that. But be that as it may, or more importantly, the suffragettes in San Francisco wanted to make a big point that women were part of the community. So they organized them heavily, and certainly middle-class women went out and voted. And the result was the bond issue passed by 92%, which was a great tribute to Rolf, and also a general idea that this notion of a civic center was accepted by the public in general. Nobody said, well, you shouldn't build those big buildings, or you shouldn't have that big plaza in the middle. They just said, sure, here, I'm going to pay more taxes to make this happen. So the plan was put together. Then they needed to, remember, the fair was opened in February 1915, and we're now in the beginning of 1912, so we got 3 more years. And so everything was done on a sort of rush. So the next step was to choose architects for the city hall. And they did a competition where you had to be a registered architect in San Francisco on January 1st, 1912. No international competition, nothing from around the state. You had to be in practice in San Francisco. And they got 77 submissions, many from architects that you may have heard of, prominent architects. But they had a panel and they worked it down to one winner. Can you push the next? This was the winning design. It came from a young firm called Blakewell Brown, particularly Arthur Brown. Both of these men had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. Both of them had studied at UC Berkeley. They studied civil engineering because there wasn't an architecture department. They went to a Saturday sort of seminar that Bernard Maybeck gave, and he also recommended them to Mrs. Hearst for a stipend to go to the École. But Arthur Brown's father was the chief engineer of the Central Pacific Railroad. So Arthur Brown grew up in a household that, father was not only building tunnels and bridges, but he was building train stations and hotels. And so Arthur Brown was steeped in architecture by the time he had gone to the École, and he was considered the most brilliant student from America that had been there. And he stayed there several years longer than most students. But when he came back, he opened an office, and there were things to do. He did the little city hall in Berkeley. But the story is that when he and Bakewell designed this city hall, they weren't very busy, which was one of the reasons why they could put so much attention and thinking into this structure. The general instructions for the competition said you needed to build a 4-story building with a significant architectural feature in the middle. And some people put an office building there, and some had a low dome, and so forth. But this one, Kevin Starr used to say it was a building of imperial pretensions. You want to do the next slide? People want to know where the dome came from. And I'm talking too much, but I'll try to be quicker. The dome didn't come from London or Rome. This is the L'Église des Invalides in Paris, which is part of the Les Invalides, which is a complex of buildings built by Louis XIV. It's kind of a veterans home and a military hospital. And you can see the resemblance, except that there's a lot more gold in this one. And this building has Napoleon in a casket on the base. But that's where it came from. Next slide. Here are the architects. The two on the right-hand side are Bakewell and Brown, and the other two are two Frenchmen, classmates of theirs that they brought over from Paris to work on the project. But they got underway right away, and were working away, bearing in mind that they had this very tight schedule. Next slide. Howard finished his, or published this plan in in 1913 to give the public an idea of what his civic center was like. And you can see the City Hall, the plaza, the other buildings that Rolfe had gotten commitments from were a state building, and either Steve or Greg make reference to the fact that the court went to San Francisco in that building, the old public library, an auditorium which the exhibition built to have conventions in, and an opera house which never got built. And if you read my book, you will find out, but that was the next step out of that came the War Memorial Complex, which I don't have time to talk about. So that was the idea, and it was this building that was going to be made available to the public. It wasn't for fancy people, it was for everybody. Next slide. Here's a better idea of the plaza. It gives you some idea of the public realm. Now, this was designed for people in 1915, but you can see the four sort of subgroups and the trees on the outside and so forth. Next slide. Well, now we zip up through the Second World War, and we're into the 1950s, which is a world. I should say that Mayor Rolfe served as mayor for 20 years, was elected governor in 1931, and he fought for. He always loved the Civic Center, and by the time he left office, there were 8 buildings done there. And after he left, there was no one quite as much of an advocate, and after the Second World War, people forgot about that. The architects were mostly gone, and it was a world where there was a sort of utopian concept, and some people attacked Civic Center as being undemocratic. It wasn't related to California. The architecture was all foreign, etc. But the city fathers decided that they would do some reorganizing, and the auditorium had become the local convention hall, and the Travel and Visitors Bureau wanted more space. In fact, they wanted a new building, but the city fathers weren't going to give them a new building, not at the public's expense. But they gave them an exhibition hall, so they dug up the plaza once, and then they dug up it a second time to put a garage in next door. And when it came to the replacing the plaza, the idea originally was to replace it with what was there, but Mayor Christopher said he didn't like that. Next slide. So they brought over from Berkeley a landscape architect named Bayliss, who created a new plan with, instead of trees around the edge, trees up the middle, and a pond up the middle, a rectangular pond. I'm sorry I don't have a bigger picture, but that little rectangle in the middle is a pond. Some people claimed it was put there so that to keep away the public demonstrations and public arenas and other sorts of things. Actually, Mayor Christopher looked out this window and said he didn't like that either. And so for the next 10 or 15 years, there wasn't much money spent on it, and the whole place kind of became ignored. Next slide. The thing that sort of brought things back to the attention of the public was the effort to create a new main library. The old main library, which had been designed by George Kellum and opened in 1917, had actually become at capacity in 1944, and in the years subsequent, they had built shelves in the hallways and done various other things, and there were there was an organization created called the Friends of the Library, and it was led by several very dominant women, known as the Library Ladies, and they got the idea in 1984. It was time to get a $100 million bond issue passed for a new main library. the chore was to convince Mayor Feinstein that that made sense. And Mayor and Senator Feinstein are rather tight-fisted, and she didn't buy into that right away. I suggested to her that rather than just look at the bond issue for a new library, she should take the whole thing and make it into an effort to replan Civic Center. What are we going to do with the old library? There's have been a need for a courthouse, and so she had the city staff work for a year or two to prepare a whole new master plan for the Civic Center, down to reviving the plaza and fixing up City Hall. She published that shortly before she left office, and so I attribute to her in the book as the second most important person after Mayor Rolfe for the Civic Center. And with her endorsement, and then Mayor Agnos was elected, he was very supportive of the library. The bond issue passed, and the library got built, as did the courthouse, and the Asian Art Museum came to the old main library with a great deal of struggle from the preservationists. But the public area sort of continued. Well, I should make reference to the fact we had an earthquake in '89, which damaged all of the public buildings. None of them collapsed, but it was felt by the engineers that if there was another earthquake, they would. And so plans were made to restore and seismically strengthen everything. The City Hall, the Opera House. The state undertook redoing their courthouse, and they demolished the old state office building, built a new one. The federal building, the feds redid their building. I think $1.5 billion was spent on these buildings, but again, the public realm was not taken care of. And what I mean are the streets, the plaza, and so forth. And so this sort of void was there, and it became populated by people who were sort of marginal, and so normal people didn't spend much time there. Things began to change. When Mayor Newsom was elected, he certainly tried, but he was not able to do too much. Then, next slide. This philanthropist came by, literally, 6 or 7 years ago, Helen Diller, and said, you have some tawdry little playgrounds in the plaza, and I would like to donate money to make them really great. So needless to say, the Rec and Park director said, that's terrific, can we make a deal? And they thought that initially it would cost $5 million after all the planning and efforts and so forth, and it actually cost $10 million, but Mrs. Diller wasn't frightened off by the price. And so we have these two great playgrounds, and then next to the playgrounds, her family said that there should be a little cafe for people to come by and have some a little snack. Well, they said, we'll put up some money for that. That cost $1.2 million, and it's called the By-Right Cafe. And there's hundreds of people there every day, and they have sort of low-budget items for children, $1 or $2 for this and that. So that helped begin to bring people in. And then Mayor Lee organized various efforts to activate the area. So we have more farmers markets. We have Sundays where there are athletic events and so forth. Next slide. But we needed a new plan, how to eventually redo the area, and this is somewhat relevant to what your concerns are in Sacramento, how to take all this space and make it more than just a piece of land and trees that you didn't want to spend much time in. So Mayor Lee directed the planning department in 2014 to develop a public realm plan. And this is the last version, which is being shown around to get approval before the environmental process done. So, and we in California take forever to do anything. But I think it's actually brilliant because it takes the 1912 plan as a template and then changes. So you can see the trees on the outside rather than the middle. The water feature is not two ponds, but a very intriguing sort of 1.5 inch sheen of water that will be there, but if you need to get rid of it for a demonstration or a public event, it just sort of drains. There's a better area for public performances. The Board of Supervisors, in their infinite wisdom, declared that that plaza was the Joseph L. Alioto Performing Arts Piazza. But it was hard to have a performance there with the 2 lines of trees that are currently there because they got in the way of people sitting. They keep the playgrounds. Then in Fulton Street, which the original plan had as a parking lot, they put in grass. Fulton Street is between the Asian Art Museum and the public library. The public library will have activities on its front porch, if you will. The Asian Art Museum is talking about a sculpture garden. And then we have UN Plaza, which was originally a street, but then when they built BART, it got converted into another sort of dead area with a BART entrance that looks like an entrance to a cave or a mine, huge hole in the ground, and then a fountain that Lawrence Halpern designed, which has never worked properly. So the current designers have decided to recommend putting greens and plants in the fountain instead of water, because the water blew all over everywhere, and if you will, people did nasty things in it and so forth. And then the idea is to put a structure over the hole into the BART station. You still will get in and out, but you won't have this big open space about it. And so that's being shown around. The last slide, please. Here's a different view of the perspective of what it might look like. So there's 150 years of Civic Center, of dealing with how to make this notion of a civic center work in the 21st century, how to take these big, grand spaces and make them useful to the public, and that's across the board. To the north of Civic Center is the Tenderloin, which of course a whole lot of very low-income people live in people with lots of children. So this is where we are, and I'm really grateful to Greg and to Steve for letting me tell you about this, and I'm grateful for you all for coming to find out what we're doing in San Francisco and hopefully learn a few things about the history of urban planning and landscape architecture. And I'm happy to take any questions, although I'm probably talk more than I wanted to. First question?
Are these all city county properties that are in those buildings that were going up? One of our issues here is that we have the state kind of intertwined with city buildings, county buildings, federal buildings. In San Francisco, is that all pretty much local development?
No, there's a few private parcels. There's a theater. The big building right here is the federal office building, also built by Arthur Brown and opened in 1936. But the feds redid it for Sessions work, I think quite well. Unfortunately, they have a security system which is such that very few people can get inside. And then the state has their buildings. The street, of course, is the city has several of the buildings. More questions?
One of the challenges of the San Francisco Civic Center and our downtown is homelessness. Has it always been people being homeless or camping in the San Francisco Civic Center? Has that always been the history of it, or is that recent phenomenon?
Well, homelessness didn't really start in San Francisco until 1985 or thereabouts, but it's been prevalent. And Right. Here's a question. Well, as I mentioned, almost all the buildings, with the exception of one or two, have been done. There is some thinking about, among some city people, that the space between the Asian Art Museum and the library should be the first project. Both of them, have significant access to philanthropy, and the Asian is doing some remodeling of their building, but it would have that area would have green space in the middle, and it might have space for recreational and athletic activities. But on either side, if you eliminate the parking, you have more room to work with. So, but there's certainly the director of recreational parks, Parks and Recreation and Park, is eager to get the trees out of the middle of the plaza because they interfere with so many things. So I can't say for sure, but we have to go through the environmental process, and we have to approve the plan before anybody can do anything. Anyway, my book has a lot of fun stories. There's a whole section about the various architects in San Francisco feuding with each other, which is kind of unprecedented. Nobody seems to have heard of anything quite like that anywhere else in the country. There's the whole story of building the War Memorial and the tension between the officer veterans who thought an opera house would be a great memorial, but the enlisted veterans thought they should have more of an American Legion clubhouse with a bar and a swimming pool. And there's still some residual resentment even today over that conflict. And there's lots of stories about Mayor Rolfe, and it's actually quite a good read. You can, of course, get it on Amazon, or maybe you can talk one of your local bookstores into ordering copies for you. One more question? I'm not quite getting you.
Obviously, proximity to the courts is important, but is there other background or other research you've done on Hastings being located there? Is it to have young people, scholars downtown? What's kind of the thinking behind that?
Hastings originally was located in the old City Hall, the one that collapsed. And after that, they moved around to several places, and eventually ended up on the edge of Civic Center. They're behind the federal building. And they have gotten state money to build a new classroom building because the old one is really old and seismically weakened. And they're planning to tear that down and building it into a new residence hall for students. And so they're a vital component of the greater Civic Center area. And did I answer your question? Okay. Thank you.